Leo Moretti? The name that strikes fear across Europe. A mafia boss with no heart, no mercy, no love. But everything changed the day he got the call. Sir. Elena's in the hospital. She's in labor. He froze. His ex. Having his children. Twins. And in that moment, something he never felt before stirred in his chest. Guilt. Fear. Love. All at once. You don't belong here, Leo? You left us, Elena's trembling voice echoed, but Leo wasn't leaving this time. Not for anything. Not for anyone, because now, he's facing the most impossible choice of his life. Protect his family. Or risk losing everything to the blood-soaked world he created. This is the story of the mafia boss who felt nothing. Until the moment he saw his children for the first time. The world had learned to whisper his name, never speak it. Leo Moretti, the ghost who walked among the living, dressed in suits tailored to perfection and silence sharper than any blade. He was the kind of man whose eyes could make a killer tremble and whose smile never reached his soul. People called him the man without a heart, and for years, he proved them right. Once, a long time ago, there was warmth behind that cold gaze, a flicker of light named Elena, a woman who painted his world with colors he never thought he deserved. But when she walked away, taking every trace of softness with her, something inside Leo shattered beyond repair. He didn't rage or beg. He simply stood at the window that night, watching her car disappear into the storm, and with every raindrop that hit the glass, another piece of his humanity washed away. In the years that followed, he built an empire from ashes, drugs, arms, underground deals. Everything that glittered in sin had his fingerprints on it. Men feared him, women desired him, but no one truly knew him. He was surrounded by people, yet lonelier than ever, living in a fortress of marble and blood. Every night, the mansion echoed with silence, his reflection haunting him more than the ghosts of those he'd buried. He worked until dawn, drank until the pain dulled, and punished any sign of weakness, in himself or others. His lieutenants often said Leo didn't feel, didn't bleed, didn't love. They were right. He had taught himself that emotions were weapons, dangerous, unpredictable, fatal. But deep down, buried beneath the empire, there remained one forbidden name he never allowed himself to speak. Elena. Sometimes, when he passed a woman wearing her perfume, his chest would tighten before he forced the thought away. He told himself she had moved on, maybe married, maybe happy, and he convinced himself he didn't care. Until that one night. He was sitting in his private study, the room dimly lit by amber light, whiskey glass in hand, a pile of contracts scattered across his desk. His empire was expanding to Spain, another victory, another meaningless triumph. He brought the glass to his lips when his phone buzzed, cutting through the stillness. It was an unfamiliar number, local. He almost ignored it, but something, maybe instinct, maybe fate, made him answer. What? He barked coldly. The voice on the other end trembled. Mr. Moretti, this is St. Helena Hospital. The woman hesitated, we found your number in Ms. Elena Rossi's phone. She's in labor, and she's asking for. The glass slipped from Leo's hand, shattering against the marble floor. The world seemed to stop, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. His pulse roared in his ears, and for the first time in years, fear crept into the heart he claimed didn't exist. Repeat that, he whispered, his voice low but trembling. Elena? She's in labor, the nurse said gently, and she's asking for you. For a second, Leo forgot how to breathe. He stood there, unmoving, staring at nothing as 1,000 thoughts collided in his head. Labor? How could that be? She was gone for almost 2 years. Why would she call him? Why now? The silence in the room grew unbearable, broken only by the steady ticking of the antique clock behind him. He felt his chest tighten, his hands trembling slightly, something they hadn't done since he was a boy. He dismissed the thought that came next, the one he didn't dare admit aloud. What if the baby was his? He poured another drink, but his hand shook too much to hold the glass. The ice clinked violently as he tried to suppress the storm building inside him. For years, He prided himself on control of people, of business, of emotion, but now, a single name, a single call, had shattered every wall he'd built. Memories flooded him, Elena laughing in the kitchen, her hair tangled in his shirt. The way she'd press her hand against his chest and whisper, "One day, this heart will beat again." He used to mock her for saying that. Now it echoed like prophecy. He turned toward the large mirror across the room and stared at his reflection, dark eyes, lifeless expression, but somewhere in that reflection, he saw something he hadn't seen in years: fear. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and keys. His guards outside exchanged nervous glances. They had never seen their boss move so fast, so recklessly. "Get the car," he ordered, voice low but sharp. "Now." As they drove through the night, rain lashed against the windows, and lightning flashed over the highway, painting his face in fleeting streaks of white. Every second felt heavier than the last. He tried to silence his thoughts, but Elena's voice echoed in his head, overlapping with the cry of thunder, "She's in labor. Asking for you." What if she was dying? What if he was too late? He gritted his teeth, pressing a hand against the glass, the city lights blurring into streaks. He wasn't sure what he would say if he saw her again. Would she hate him? Probably. Would she let him near her? Unlikely. But none of that mattered. All he knew was that the cold empire he had built, the thousands of lives under his command, meant nothing compared to one woman in a hospital bed. For the first time in years, Leo Moretti felt something he didn't recognize: panic, regret, love, all twisting into one unbearable ache. And as the car sped through the storm towards St. Helena Hospital, the man who once swore he had no heart felt it beating again, harder with every mile. Like it was reminding him that no amount of power could protect him from the pain he had buried. The man without a heart was finally feeling alive, and it terrified him. The car skidded to a stop outside St. Helena Hospital, tires screeching against the soaked pavement as rain poured like bullets from the dark sky. Leo stepped out before the driver could open the door, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles, coat soaked in seconds, yet he didn't care. The bright hospital lights glared against the black night, sterile and cold, but to Leo, it felt like walking into Judgment Day. The guards followed, but he raised a hand sharply, his voice cutting through the storm. "Stay here." His tone allowed no argument, though his eyes betrayed something they'd never seen before: unease. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and the faint echo of crying children hit him like a wave. He'd been in many places filled with pain: prisons, graveyards, battlefields, but this one felt different. The receptionist froze as he approached, recognizing him instantly. No one expected the most feared man in Europe to walk into a maternity ward at midnight. "Elena Rossi," he said, his voice deep but edged with urgency. The woman fumbled through her computer, avoiding his gaze. "Third floor, room 312? "But sir, visiting hours are." She stopped when she met his eyes, swallowed hard, and simply nodded. Leo's boots echoed against the polished tiles as he strode toward the elevator, his reflection flashing in the metal doors. He barely recognized the man staring back, wet hair clinging to his forehead, jaw clenched, eyes burning with something raw and unfamiliar. The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum of machinery mocking his impatience. His mind kept replaying the nurse's words: "She's asking for you." Why would she? After everything he'd done, after the way he'd destroyed them both, why would she still call his name? When the doors opened, he stepped out into the dim corridor, lined with sleeping patients and faint beeping monitors. Room 312. He hesitated for the first time, hand hovering over the handle. What if she didn't want him there? What if she said his name out of anger, not love? His pulse thudded painfully in his throat as he turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the sound of rain tapping the window. She was there. Elena. Lying on the hospital bed, her face pale, hair clinging to her forehead with sweat, hands clutching the sheets in pain. Time stopped. The woman who once smiled brighter than summer looked fragile, exhausted, and yet still breathtaking. For a second, Leo couldn't move. He'd faced assassins without blinking, but seeing her like this broken, trembling felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion, and when they met his, the room filled with a silence thick enough to choke him. "Leo," she whispered, her voice fragile and disbelieving. He stepped forward, but words failed him. His throat was dry, heart pounding too loudly to think. "Why? Why are you here?" she asked, her tone wavering between anger and something softer. He wanted to say he didn't know, but that would be a lie. He knew exactly why, because even after all this time, her pain still owned him. "You called," he managed finally, his voice rough, uneven. She looked confused, as if she didn't remember, then a small, bitter smile touched her lips. "I wasn't calling for you, Leo. I was calling for help." The words hit harder than any bullet. He nodded slowly, taking the blow without defense. He deserved that. Every ounce of it. He took another step closer, the soft squeak of his shoes the only sound between them. "Elena," he began, but she turned her head away, eyes filling with tears. "Don't," she whispered, "don't say my name like it still means something." He froze, the weight of her words pressing down like a sentence. He had imagined this reunion 1,000 ways angry, cold, emotional, but not like this. Not with her so broken, and him so powerless. He wanted to touch her hand, to say something that would make her believe he'd changed. But deep down he knew he hadn't. He was still the same man who'd chosen the empire over her. Who'd let greed devour love. His gaze drifted to her stomach. And his breath caught when he saw the curve beneath the thin blanket, the unmistakable sign of new life. He swallowed hard, voice barely audible. Is it mine?" She didn't answer, just looked away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. He took a shaky breath, running a hand through his wet hair. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing across the window, casting his shadow over her like a dark omen. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her tone softer now but filled with exhaustion. "This isn't your world, Leo. You bring death everywhere you go. I won't let you bring it here." Her words sliced through him, because they were true. For years, every place he went turned into a graveyard of broken trust and spilled blood. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't want to destroy, he just wanted to protect. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, though his voice cracked slightly. Elena turned her head, her lips parting in disbelief. Before she could answer, a sharp cry escaped her throat as another contraction hit. Panic surged through Leo. He reached out instinctively, grabbing her hand. She tried to pull away but lacked the strength. "Breathe," he whispered, almost pleading. "Just breathe, Elena." She squeezed his hand, eyes shut tight, tears streaming down. The nurse rushed in, adjusting the four, glancing nervously between them. "She's progressing fast," the nurse said, unaware of who he was. Leo didn't respond. His entire world was Elena's trembling hand in his. He'd never prayed before, but in that moment, he would have traded every ounce of power for her safety. The monitors beeped faster, the tension rising with each sound. Leo's chest felt tight, his pulse unsteady. He looked down at her, sweat glistening on her forehead, her breathing uneven. "You have to go," she whispered weakly. "You can't see me like this." But he didn't move. His grip only tightened. "I've seen worse," he murmured. "But not something that scares me like this." Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his once more, and in that shared gaze, the years of silence, anger, and longing all collided into something too painful to name. Then suddenly, the machines around them began to beep louder, the nurse shouting for a doctor. Leo's stomach dropped. He stepped back, frozen as chaos filled the room. Her blood pressures dropping. Someone yelled. Leo's world tilted. The cold, unshakable Mafia boss felt his heart hammer like a trapped animal as doctors swarmed the bed. He could only stand there, powerless, watching the woman he'd once loved, maybe still loved, fight for her life in front of him. And for the first time in years, Leo Moretti whispered a prayer into the storm. Leo's boots pounded against the sterile hospital floors, echoing through the empty corridors as if the walls themselves were trembling under the weight of his fury and fear. The antiseptic stung his nostrils, sharp and sterile, mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood. And it reminded him painfully that this was a place of fragility. A place where power meant nothing and the cold steel of his reputation could not protect him from the raw, uncontrollable chaos of life. Each step brought him closer to her, closer to Elena, and yet, with every second, an unfamiliar terror gnawed at the edges of his composure. People in the halls moved aside like shadows, sensing the storm behind him, a presence so imposing that whispers died mid-air and even the janitor froze with broom in hand. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their fear. His focus entirely on the window at the end of the corridor where he had glimpsed her, writhing in pain, gripping the sheets as though they were the only anchor left in the world. Screaming through the unbearable agony that made his chest constrict with a pain deeper than any bullet wound he had ever survived. He could hear her cries even before he opened the doors, each shriek piercing him, twisting his gut in ways he thought were impossible, tearing at a heart he had long buried beneath years of blood, deals, and vengeance. Then the nurse's voice rang out, high-pitched and desperate, "We're losing her." Instinct took over, bypassing reason, strategy, or any sense of self-preservation, and Leo burst through the doors, pushing aside anyone who dared to slow him. The sudden flurry of movement startled the staff, but the command in his eyes froze them instantly. This was no ordinary man. This was the storm incarnate, and he was here to claim what belonged to him. "Don't touch her!" a doctor yelled, panic threading through his voice as he reached for the flailing hands of the guards who had followed Leo Indiana. Leo growled low, the sound like a growl from some ancient predator, the hairs on his neck rising, voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "That's my woman." The room seemed to tilt, the monitors beeping fading into the background as his gaze locked onto Elena. Her eyes, wide and glistening with tears, met his, filled with a mixture of shock, pain, and something he had not anticipated, lingering betrayal. She tried to turn away, voice weak and trembling, whispering words that stabbed at him sharper than any blade. "You don't belong here, Leo. You left us." Us? The single word struck like lightning, igniting every buried memory, every suppressed emotion he had spent years building walls around. It wasn't anger that surged, nor vengeance, nor pride. It was the kind of helplessness he had spent his life avoiding. The realization that despite his empire, his power, his fearsome reputation, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered, her trust. Her life in his hands, their connection that had once been unbreakable. He stood frozen for the briefest moment, just long enough for a bead of sweat to slide down his temple, watching her shiver in pain and vulnerability, powerless to shield her in the way he had sworn he would if he could turn back time. The nurse moved swiftly, checking the monitors and gesturing frantically to the doctor, and Leo could feel the tension in the room coil around him, tightening as if the walls themselves were aware that something monumental was about to unfold. His mind raced, not with strategies or contingencies, not with threats or calculations, but with memories. The way she had laughed at the small jokes he had tried so hard to make. The gentle pressure of her hand on his chest. The warmth of her presence that once made the world seem less dangerous. And yet, none of that prepared him for the raw, immediate reality of seeing her in this state, alone in her pain, and somehow still looking at him with the faintest flicker of accusation. He stepped closer, instinct screaming at him to do something, anything. But he remembered the warnings of doctors, the fragility of life before him. But his hand trembled as it hovered near hers, and then he realized, he couldn't stop. He had never felt more human, more exposed, more aware of his own mortality and the limits of power, than in that moment when the woman he had abandoned was hanging by a thread between life and death. Each contraction she endured sent a shock through him. A visceral reminder that he had once been incapable of leaving the battlefield unscathed, but now the battlefield was her body. her life, and he had no armor against the fear, love, and regret that consumed him. Time seemed to warp, stretching each second into an eternity as the doctors and nurses moved around him in a blur. But his focus never wavered from her face, from her trembling hands, from the rise and fall of her chest that mirrored the chaos in his own. She tried to speak, lips parting in effort, and he leaned in, almost afraid to hear the words, almost afraid to realize that she had moved on, almost afraid to admit that he had failed in ways that couldn't be undone. But then, a sharp scream tore through the room, louder than any he had ever heard, more desperate, more primal, and it shattered the fragile control he had over himself. He rushed to her side instinctively, gripping the edge of the bed, feeling the fragility of her flesh and bone beneath his fingers, the life teetering between him and oblivion. And for a heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. Her eyes met his again, wide and vulnerable. And something inside him broke, a dam of emotions he thought had dried up decades ago: anger, regret, fear, and an overwhelming, undeniable love that clawed at his chest and left him gasping for air. He realized, in that instant, that power had never been protection, money had never been a shield, and fear had never been a weapon against the inevitable truth that he loved her, that he had always loved her, and that the past, no matter how long buried, had never truly died. The monitors beeped frantically, the nurses shouted instructions, and doctors moved with urgent precision, but Leo's focus remained locked on Elena, a man stripped bare of all pretense, ego, and control, standing on the edge of helplessness, realizing that despite everything he had conquered in the world, he had never been more vulnerable than in this moment, facing the woman who had always held his heart and whose life, his life, and possibly their future hung precariously in the balance, leaving him with nothing but the unbearable ache of love, fear, and a past that refused to stay buried. The room was a whirlwind of movement, the sterile air filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic and the metallic tang of blood. Yet Leo's attention remained fixed solely on Elena, her face pale and glistening with sweat, hands gripping the sheets as if they could anchor her to life, her body writhing with contractions that made his chest tighten with a pain he had never imagined, a pain that eclipsed the agony of gunshots, betrayal, and endless battles he had survived. And yet it was nothing compared to the helplessness gnawing at him now, the raw, primal terror of seeing the woman he had abandoned fighting for life and breath while he could do nothing but watch, his hands clenching into fists, knuckles white, nails digging into his palms, every instinct screaming at him to protect her, to hold her, to somehow take the pain away even though he knew he could not, that no amount of power, wealth, or fear could shield her from the storm of childbirth and the chaos threatening to consume them both. And still she looked at him with eyes wide, torn between accusation and a desperate plea that he didn't fully understand. And for a moment, Leo wanted to fall to his knees, to beg for forgiveness, to admit the years of coldness, the fortress of stone he had built around himself, the empire of violence that had driven her away. But he couldn't, because he had to stay standing, had to be the anchor she could cling to, however impossible that seemed when every fiber of his being was trembling with emotions he had long suppressed. And then the doctor barked orders, voice slicing through the thick tension in the room: "We need to stabilize her. Push," and nurses rushed around the bed, moving with practiced precision. But Leo's mind was spinning in slow motion, every detail of the moment magnified, the way her hands trembled, the sheen of sweat on her forehead, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the faint whimpering of pain that threatened to fracture his own composure. And he realized in that instant that no fight he had ever fought, no deal he had ever made, no life he had taken could compare to the battle happening right here, right now, in this small hospital room, a battle that was entirely out of his control. And yet he felt an overwhelming urge to claim it as his own, to bear it, to somehow carry the weight so that she could survive, so that she could see the world safe again, and perhaps, in some impossible way, forgive him, even if only a fraction of what had been lost. And the nurse shouted again, "We're losing her." Blood pressures dropping. And panic surged through Leo like a wave, heat coursing through his veins. Anger and fear blending into a storm that made him clench the bed frame. Leaning closer, almost as if his proximity alone could stave off the chaos. And Elena's eyes met his once more, full of vulnerability, fear. And the quiet accusation of 1,000 unspoken words. "You left us," she whispered again. Voice trembling with every ounce of her strength, and he wanted to tell her everything. To spill the truths and regrets that had piled inside him over the years. To say he was sorry in a way words could never capture. But the world around them would not wait for confessions. The monitors screamed louder, alarms blared. And the medical staff moved faster. Each second a razor's edge closer to disaster, and Leo realized with a cold, sinking certainty that this was the moment that would define him. That would strip away the last vestiges of his carefully curated invincibility. And that the past, the love, the mistakes, the abandonment, was colliding with the present in the most brutal way imaginable. Forcing him to confront not only the woman he had once adored but the consequences of every choice he had ever made. Every wall he had ever built to keep himself untouchable, and he couldn't move, couldn't speak. Could barely breathe as he watched her fight with everything inside her. His soul tied to hers in a way he had never allowed himself to admit. And then, as if the universe demanded a final test of his resilience, another scream echoed through the room, sharper, more desperate. And a nurse shouted, "She's crowning. Push!" The words hit him like a gunshot, and Leo's body went rigid. Every instinct screamed to act, but he knew he couldn't interfere in the mechanics of life. Could only be there, presence a tether. Hand hovering near hers, though she gripped it tightly. Almost as if sensing his need to claim some part of the struggle as his own. His throat was dry, but a low growl escaped, not in anger, but in sheer desperation. "Elena, stay with me. Don't give up." Her eyes met his, tears streaming freely, and for a fleeting moment, they were suspended in a space where time had no meaning. A place where years of anger, loss, and distance collapsed into a single heartbeat. The storm outside the hospital raging as violently as the one inside his chest. And then the nurse's voice pierced that fragile stillness, urgent, commanding, "We need you back, doctor. Now." Chaos swirled around him. The sound of medical equipment, shouted instructions. And Elena's own cries blending into a symphony of fear and hope. And Leo could only stand frozen, body trembling, eyes fixed on her. Feeling more powerless than he had in all his years of rule. More vulnerable than he had ever been when facing an army or rival boss, yet more alive. More painfully aware of the fragility and preciousness of life than any battlefield had ever made him. And as he watched her fight for survival, for breath, for life, Leo realized that the past had never truly died, that love, regret, and memory were not things to be buried or conquered, but forces that demanded acknowledgement. That shaped the choices of the present in ways he could not escape. And even as the doctors fought to keep her alive, even as the alarms continued their relentless chorus, he felt the undeniable truth sear through him, the woman before him, the life she carried, the history they shared, and the part of him he had tried to kill years ago were intertwined in a way that no power or distance could sever. Leaving him with nothing but the unbearable, exhilarating, terrifying certainty that the past was alive. And if he didn't act now, if he didn't somehow hold on to it, he might lose everything forever. And in that instant, the world narrowed to her voice. The sound of her breath, the tension in the monitors, and the invisible thread between them. A thread of love, of memory, of unhealed wounds. Pulling him into the abyss of helplessness and devotion simultaneously. And Leo knew, with every ounce of himself, that the coming minutes would either destroy him completely or forge a new reality, leaving him poised on the edge of fate, staring into the most vulnerable, beautiful, and terrifying part of life he had ever encountered. And as another contraction hit Elena, sharp and relentless, he whispered, almost as if it were a prayer and a threat at the same time, "I will not let anything happen to you. Not now, not ever." The air in the delivery room shifted in an instant. A strange, almost sacred silence descending after the storm of pain and fear. As if the universe itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold, and then, it happened. Two piercing cries cut through the tension like twin lightning bolts, shattering the silence that had wrapped the room in a fragile cocoon and announcing the arrival of life with a force so raw and undeniable that even the most seasoned doctors and nurses froze for a heartbeat, stunned by the perfection of the moment and the magnitude of its impact. And Leo Moretti, who had faced assassins, betrayals, and wars across continents, stood frozen, hands trembling uncontrollably, heart hammering against his chest in a rhythm he could barely recognize as his own. As his eyes fell upon the tiny, fragile faces of the twins, one boy, one girl, the soft curve of their features, the perfect innocence in their eyes, the faint wails that were more demanding than any command he had ever given, more urgent than any threat he had ever issued, and yet utterly helpless in their reliance on the world, and on him, though he had never asked for it before. And Elena, lying back exhausted, sweat gleaming on her forehead, cheeks flushed and eyes still shimmering with tears, whispered words that cut through the storm inside him. Her voice fragile but resolute, "They're yours, Leo," and in that instant the name, the claim, the responsibility hit him with a weight he could scarcely bear. And every guard, every bodyguard stationed outside the room, every person who had ever whispered his name in fear, heard a sound that no one thought they would ever hear from the man they knew as invincible, ruthless, untouchable. Leo Moretti, the Mafia boss who had felt nothing for years, was sobbing uncontrollably, raw, broken, utterly human. A man laid bare before life itself, and he could not comprehend how something so small, so delicate, could wield such power over him, over his very soul, twisting his insides, unraveling every carefully constructed layer of coldness he had spent decades building, because here they were, the living proof of a past he had abandoned, a love he had failed, and a future he had never dared to imagine, staring up at him with tiny hands curling, mouths opening in silent pleas, and he wanted to reach out, to hold them, to protect them from every shadow, every threat, every danger that existed in his world. And yet Elena, weak but determined, turned away just as he moved closer, and her words, cold, wet, and shattering, struck him harder than any bullet or betrayal he had ever endured. "You weren't there when I needed you," she said. And it was not a question but a condemnation, a mirror reflecting every failure he had ever committed, every moment he had chosen empire over love. And Leo's voice broke, raw and desperate. "I'm here now," he whispered, almost pleading, almost afraid that the words would not be enough, almost terrified that she would turn her back entirely. And her eyes, filled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and lingering love he could feel pressing against his chest like a vice, met his gaze, and she said the words that made his knees feel weak. The words he had dreaded and somehow expected, "You'll leave again." Just like before, and the certainty of her accusation ignited a fire within him, a determination as fierce as any battlefield rage he had ever known, and he swore, low and unwavering, never, his hands shaking as he reached for the infants, for their warmth, for the tangible proof that he could still choose to fight for something pure, something untainted. And for a fleeting moment, hope flickered, fragile yet stubborn, like a candle in the storm, that perhaps this was his chance to redeem himself, to protect what he had lost, to prove that he could be more than the man without a heart, more than the shadow that haunted Europe with fear. And yet, before he could cradle them safely, the doctor cut in sharply, voice slicing through the fragile calm like steel. "Mr. Moretti, there's a problem. One of the twins isn't breathing," and the words detonated in his chest, freezing him in place as panic, dread, and terror crashed through him in waves stronger than any bullet wound, stronger than any betrayal, because this was not a war he could dominate with fear or strategy. This was life itself slipping through his fingers, the tiny pulse of one child threatening to falter. And he felt every heartbeat of the infant as if it were his own, every breath that faltered an echo of failure he could not tolerate. And instinct took over, adrenaline sharpening every sense, every nerve screaming, eyes darting between the baby, Elena, and the frantic medical team, hands twitching, wanting to intervene. Yet knowing that his touch could not fix what nature and circumstance had thrown at them, and in that moment, the past and present collided, all his regrets, all his choices, all the years he had spent building walls around himself, crashing down in a torrent of guilt and love, and he realized that no power, no empire, no amount of intimidation could save the one thing he now knew he could never live without. And he had only seconds, mere moments, to act, to hope, to pray that life would bend in his favor. And Elena, weak and trembling, reached for his hand, clutching it as tightly as her own strength would allow, eyes wide with fear and silent plea, and in that simple touch, the bond they had shared, broken though it was, reignited in a blaze of emotion that left him gasping, every muscle tensed, every thought consumed with the possibility of loss. And as the doctors worked frantically, Leo's knuckles whitened, teeth grinding, a low growl escaping his throat. The sound a mixture of desperation, terror, and raw love. Because for the first time in his life, the battlefield was not the streets, the boardrooms, or the shadows, it was the fragile life of a child, the life of his own flesh and blood. And the thought of failing, of losing, of allowing history to repeat itself, filled him with a terror he could scarcely contain, leaving him suspended on the edge of panic, hope, and the unbearable weight of responsibility. And as he stared at the tiny form of the struggling infant, Leo knew that nothing in his entire life, not power, not vengeance, not blood, could prepare him for the terror, the love, and the heartbreak that awaited in the next heartbeat. Leo's body tensed as the room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors moving with urgent precision around him, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of alarms and shouted instructions. Yet he could hear nothing but the rapid beating of his own heart and the faint, desperate cries of the tiny infant who lay between life and death in the hands of fate, a reality that no amount of wealth, power, or fear could alter. And he felt an unfamiliar, burning helplessness coil around him, tightening like a vice, leaving his chest raw, his breath shallow, and his hands trembling despite every ounce of his notorious control. Because this was not a threat he could intimidate, a deal he could manipulate, or a rival he could destroy. This was life itself, fragile, dependent, and terrifyingly uncertain, and Leo had never been more acutely aware of his own vulnerability. Elena's face was etched with exhaustion, tears streaming down her cheeks as she gripped his hand with what little strength she had left. Eyes filled with a silent plea that pierced him deeper than any betrayal ever had, and he realized, painfully, that she was not only fighting for herself but for the life he had never dared to acknowledge until this moment. The life that tethered him to her in a way he had spent years denying, a bond that no empire could sever, no amount of fear could control. And he wanted to scream, to curse the universe for placing him in a position where he could do nothing but wait and hope and pray. Yet the fight raging in the infant demanded more than hope, it demanded action, instinct, presence, and a heart capable of feeling in spite of every barrier he had built over the years. The doctor leaned over the fragile body, hands moving swiftly, adjustments, compressions, the blur of movements that Leo could not comprehend but watched with every fiber of his being. And when the baby's small chest faltered again, he felt as though the world itself had stopped. The weight of every decision he had made, every life he had taken, every choice he had abandoned looming over him like an executioner's shadow. And for a terrifying moment, he feared that even his devotion, his love, his presence could not alter the inevitable. That he had waited too long, that history would repeat itself, and he would lose another life that he was too late to save. Yet still, he refused to step back, refused to surrender. His fingers brushing gently against the infant's tiny hand. A silent vow that he would endure whatever torment necessary to protect this life. This fragile, perfect life, that carried his blood, his essence, and a hope for redemption he had never allowed himself to believe he deserved. And Elena, watching him, finally let out a shuddering breath. The words trembling from her lips, barely audible, "Leo, please," and the simplicity of her plea, the power of the moment, left him with no choice but to act with every ounce of his focus and strength. Abandoning the control he had spent a lifetime cultivating. Abandoning the detachment that had once defined him. And surrendering fully to the terror, the love, and the responsibility of the present. Because this child, this tiny soul, demanded it. And he could not refuse. Time became distorted. Minutes stretched into eternity as the medical staff continued their frantic work. The cries of the second twin blending with the first. A symphony of hope and fear that resonated through Leo's chest and made him aware of every heartbeat, every labored breath, every subtle movement of the infants, and he felt a raw, primal connection that no training, no upbringing, no lifetime of cruelty could have prepared him for. Realizing that this was not just about survival, it was about redemption. About proving to himself and to Elena that he could be more than the man who abandoned love. More than the shadow that haunted every hallway with fear. That he could protect, nurture, and fight for what truly mattered. Even if it meant exposing every vulnerability he had ever hidden. Every crack in the armor he had built to survive. Every ounce of emotion he had tried to suppress, yet as he reached for one twin, finally daring to cradle the small body against his chest, feeling the tiny pulse, the fragile warmth, relief surged and then froze simultaneously as a sharp cry from the doctor stopped him cold. "Mr. Moretti, we have a problem, the baby's not breathing again." The words struck him harder than any bullet ever could, and his breath caught in his throat. His knees threatening to buckle as a tidal wave of fear, guilt, and desperation crashed over him. Because everything he had built, everything he had achieved, all the power he had wielded, all the fear he had commanded, meant nothing here in this sterile room. In this precise moment, in front of the tiny, fragile life that depended entirely on him and the skill of the strangers around him. And yet, even in the face of the impossibility, he felt a surge of determination unlike anything he had ever experienced. He would not leave. He would not fail, he would not allow history to repeat itself. And he gritted his teeth, knuckles white, heart racing, as he leaned closer, whispering under his breath, a vow to the infant, to Elena, to himself: "You will survive. I swear. You will survive." And for the first time in his life, the infamous Leo Moretti, the man who had felt nothing, the man who had abandoned the only woman who ever mattered, the man who had ruled with fear and ice, was reduced to trembling desperation. Fully human, fully exposed, and utterly powerless against the fragile miracle of life. Yet determined to face it head-on. As the room seemed to constrict, the alarms blaring, the cries of the newborns mingling with the storm raging outside, leaving him suspended in a moment of unbearable tension, heart lodged in his throat, mind racing through the years of mistakes, and every instinct screaming that one wrong second could mean the difference between life and death. And as he stared into the tiny, struggling form, fingers brushing against the soft skin, a single, overwhelming truth consumed him completely. This was no longer about power, or revenge, or empire. This was about love, and fear, and hope all entwined, and the next breath the infant drew would define not only its life, but the fragile possibility of redemption for a man who had thought his heart was long dead, leaving the room pregnant with suspense, tension, and the unbearable question lingering in every soul present: would the next cry be one of life or silence? The alarms echoed violently through the delivery room, shrill and relentless. A sound that cut through Leo's chest like a knife and sent adrenaline roaring through his veins, as doctors and nurses moved with frantic precision, scooping the fragile newborn from his arms and rushing him down the hallway with rapid, practiced steps, leaving Leo rooted to the spot, legs trembling and failing him, the infamous Mafia boss collapsing to his knees on the cold, sterile tiles as if the weight of the world had finally come crashing down, because in all his years of bloodshed, in all the assassinations he had orchestrated, in all the betrayals he had endured, in all the prisons and power struggles he had conquered, he had never faced a threat so intimate, so raw, so terrifyingly absolute as the possibility of losing his own child. And the room seemed to constrict around him. alarms blending into the pounding of his heart, breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. Yet failed, feeling helpless in a way that no empire, no reputation, no fear could have prepared him for. While Elena, pale and exhausted, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, the vulnerability of the moment stripping away every layer of pride, anger, and control they had ever clung to. And for the first time, Leo felt powerless. A feeling he had spent decades suppressing. A feeling that made his hands shake, his knees buckle, and the steel of his persona crumble. Because this was not a boardroom, not a battlefield, not a war between rival families, this was life itself teetering on the edge. Delicate, fragile, and entirely beyond his control. And as he sank to the floor, memories of every failure, every abandoned promise, every day he had turned his back on love came crashing down, intertwining with the present in a way that left him breathless. Guilt coiling in his chest like a living thing, squeezing him, reminding him of the lives he had failed to protect, the hearts he had broken, and now, perhaps the most devastating of all, the tiny life he might lose before he even had a chance to hold it again. Hours stretched like centuries, a blur of antiseptic, monitors, whispered reassurances, and tense waiting. Each passing minute hammering at Leo's nerves, leaving him on the edge of collapse. Mind cycling through every possibility, every contingency, every past decision that had led him to this vulnerable, exposed state, and when the doctor finally returned, exhaustion etched into his face, eyes heavy yet solemn. The words barely pierced Leo's haze, "He's stable. For now." The simple statement caused a tidal wave of relief to crash through him. And he exhaled, the sound ragged and shuddering, tears streaming silently down his hardened cheeks. Wet tracks leaving trails on the stone-cold face that had once inspired fear across continents. The notorious Leo Moretti now nothing more than a man consumed with love, fear, and devotion. Finally able to cradle the tiny life he had feared he would never see again. And as the tension drained slowly from his body, he allowed himself to move back to Elena's side. Exhausted muscles trembling under the weight of adrenaline and emotion. And there, in the quiet aftermath of chaos, he remained, sitting vigil through the long, sterile night, watching her sleep, listening to her shallow breaths, occasionally brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. And when she finally stirred, eyes blinking against the dim hospital lights, she froze at the sight that met her, Leo, sitting beside her bed, both babies swaddled gently against his chest, rocking them slightly as he hummed a soft, almost forgotten lullaby, his voice rough from disuse, yet tender, carrying a warmth that she had not heard in years. And for a fleeting moment, her heart softened, the anger and fear that had built up over years of abandonment and pain melting slightly as she saw the man she had loved so intensely, so recklessly, reduced to the simplest, most human act of all, a father cradling his children. A man willing to protect life with nothing but love and sheer presence. But just as the fragile serenity began to settle, a sharp, insistent buzz pierced the room, startling both of them, and Elena's gaze fell to her phone lying on the bedside table, screen glowing with a message that sent her blood running cold, her breath hitching in terror as she read the words. A single line from one of Leo's men, terse, urgent, and laced with deadly certainty, "The cartel is coming for revenge. Tonight." Her eyes darted up at the sleeping twins, their tiny chests rising and falling with the innocent rhythm of life, and her heart constricted in panic, fingers trembling as she glanced at Leo, who was momentarily frozen, jaw tightening, muscles coiling as if he could launch into action the instant the threat reached them, his eyes narrowing, burning with the same cold, lethal intensity that had made him a legend, yet now tempered by a raw, feral protective instinct that left no room for hesitation or compromise. And Elena's voice barely escaped her lips, trembling as she asked, "Leo? What did you do?" The question hung in the air, a mixture of fear, accusation, and disbelief, because she understood in that single instant the precariousness of their situation, the empire of blood he had built, The enemies he had made, and now the innocent lives resting in his arms. All of it converging into a single, terrifying moment where the past and present collided, leaving no margin for error, and Leo, staring at the glowing screen, felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. The calculated mind of the Mafia boss awakening alongside the raw, trembling heart of the man who had loved and lost. As he realized that he had only hours to protect everything he had just fought so desperately to hold. And the knowledge that the cartel was coming, that blood would soon spill, and that the lives of his children and the woman he loved hung in the balance, made his chest tighten, hands clench, and every nerve fire in anticipation, leaving the room thick with tension. The soft breathing of the twins a cruel counterpoint to the storm of danger approaching, and as the night pressed on, with shadows stretching across the walls and the faint hum of machines mingling with the pulse of fear and adrenaline, Leo knew one thing with terrifying clarity: the cost of his heart. The price of love had never been higher, and no empire, no bullet, no scheme could prepare him for the blood that was coming for the babies. Leo's eyes darted around the dim hospital room, taking in every shadow, every corner, every potential point of threat. The weight of the warning message pressing on him like a physical force, tightening his chest, coiling his muscles, and leaving him acutely aware that no wall, no security, no fear could shield the tiny, sleeping lives in his arms from the blood-soaked world outside. Every instinct he had honed over decades, the instincts that had allowed him to survive ambushes, betrayals, and wars, kicked in immediately, heart hammering as he processed strategies, escape routes, and contingencies. Yet the softness in his arms, the rhythmic rise and fall of the twins' chests, the faint warmth of their bodies pressed against him, tempered every ruthless thought with a raw, almost unbearable tenderness that left him trembling, vulnerable in a way no one had ever seen. And Elena, sitting up slowly, exhausted but wide-eyed with fear, watched him with a mixture of awe and terror, seeing in him both the unrelenting force of the man who had once ruled empires and the fragile, desperate father who had never imagined he could feel this kind of helpless love. And when she finally spoke, her voice quivering, "Leo, what are we going to do?" It was not a question but a plea for reassurance, for protection, for the unspoken promise that he would not let the darkness claim what they had fought so desperately to hold. And Leo, chest tight, voice low and gritted, whispered, "We survive. No one takes them," though the words felt inadequate even as they left his mouth. Because he knew the cartel's vengeance was ruthless, calculated, and brutal. A storm of death and blood that would not hesitate to strike. And every second spent planning, calculating, and waiting stretched impossibly long, as if time itself mocked the fragility of the sanctuary they had, leaving his mind racing through scenarios that would keep Elena and the twins alive. Yet none of them without risk, and he could feel the weight of every decision like an anchor, threatening to pull him under, but he refused to sink. His hands tightening around the tiny bodies, drawing strength from their vulnerability, from their trust, from the undeniable proof that life, fragile as it was, demanded courage beyond any battlefield he had faced. Hours dragged by, punctuated only by the faint breathing of the twins, the soft hum of machines, and the distant rumble of the city outside. And Leo remained a statue of tense determination, eyes scanning the room, ears straining for any sign of intrusion, body coiled like a predator waiting for the strike. While Elena, leaning back against the pillow, allowed herself a fleeting moment of hope, watching him, seeing him sing softly to the children, a lullaby he had learned long ago but never thought he'd need. A song meant to soothe tiny hearts yet now holding within it the weight of his own. And for a heartbeat, she believed that perhaps he had changed. That perhaps the man who had once been untouchable, cold, and ruthless could now be human. Could now protect, could now love without reservation. And yet that fragile hope shattered in an instant when Leo's phone buzzed sharply, vibrating against the bedside table, and his expression darkened, eyes narrowing as he read the message from his inner circle: "Cartel en route. Expect blood. Prepare defenses." Elena's breath hitched audibly, chest tightening as she glanced at the twins, peacefully unaware, and then back at Leo, whose jaw clenched. Eyes ablaze with a dangerous combination of fury, fear, and protective instinct, and she whispered. Voice barely audible, Leo. What did you do? The question was a dagger because it was both accusation and realization, the understanding that by being here, by choosing to protect, by holding the children close, he had placed them directly in the path of his world's inevitable violence. A violent world that never forgave weakness, never spared innocence, and yet, Leo, staring at her, eyes burning with unyielding resolve, answered with a whisper. A vow, a threat all at once, I did what I had to. And I will kill anyone who even breathes near them, and though the words carried the weight of lethal promise, they could not ease the storm raging outside the hospital walls. The storm that would descend like a flood of bullets, fire, and death. The minutes dragged, the night thick with anticipation. And Leo moved quietly, repositioning the babies, scanning the room for any chance of fortifying their fragile sanctuary. His mind ticking through possibilities with surgical precision. Yet every plan was shadowed by the knowledge that enemies could strike anywhere, at any moment, and the innocence in his arms meant they had no margin for error, no second chances, and as he hummed softly to calm the twins, his eyes flicked to Elena, whose gaze had hardened, wet with tears, but filled with unspoken fear and trust, and he knew that nothing could protect them unless he became both shield and sword. Calm and storm, guardian and avenger, all at once. A man who had once feared nothing but now feared only the loss of what truly mattered. The children whose tiny bodies were his tether to life and love, and as distant engines roared closer, shadows stretching across the hospital walls, every instinct in Leo screamed. Every nerve tingled, every muscle tensed. Because the coming bloodshed was inevitable, the storm unavoidable. And yet the life in his arms demanded courage beyond any he had ever known. Leaving him poised, breath held, ready to face the approaching chaos with lethal precision. And in that moment, suspended between terror, love, and the edge of violence, the silent question lingered in the air. Thick and suffocating, would the cartel strike before dawn? And if they did, could Leo protect the babies? Or would the price of his heart, the ultimate cost of love, family, and loyalty, be paid in blood, leaving him powerless once more as the darkness came crashing in? The night outside the hospital erupted in chaos. The silence shattered by the deafening roar of gunfire echoing off the cold, sterile walls, each shot reverberating through Leo's chest like a hammer against steel, sending a wave of adrenaline roaring through his veins as his men, trained, loyal, and deadly, drew their weapons with precision. Eyes narrowing, muscles coiled, ready to spill blood in defense of the small, fragile lives sleeping just down the hall, and Leo, standing amid the tension, felt the weight of every heartbeat, every shallow breath, every shadow move in rhythm with the pounding of his own pulse. The world narrowing to a single point, protect Elena and the twins at all costs, because for the first time in decades, fear had a name, and it carried the unmistakable, unbearable scent of danger aimed directly at his family. And as the shouts, commands, and gunfire blended into a violent symphony, Elena's scream pierced through the chaos like a knife. Fragile, trembling, yet urgent, their innocent, Leo. You brought this war here. Her words cut him deeper than any bullet, twisting the blade of guilt inside him, forcing him to confront the stark, painful truth of what his empire had wrought. That the lives he had fought to protect were now endangered because of the world he had created, because of the enemies he had made, and for a heartbeat, his chest constricted with conflicting emotions, rage, fear, love, and regret all vying for dominance in a storm that left him gasping for air. Vision narrowing to the figure of Elena clutching the twins, wide-eyed with terror. Every instinct screaming at him to stay, to barricade, to unleash hell upon anyone daring to come near. Yet as he turned to face her, her gaze met his, trembling but defiant. And he saw in her eyes the unspoken challenge. The plea, the accusation, the love he had failed to protect before. And he knew that no amount of firepower or intimidation could soothe the storm he had unleashed by bringing his past and present colliding into this fragile, blood-soaked moment, and with a voice low, rough, and laced with iron, he answered, almost to himself as much as to her, "Then I'll end it. Forever," and the words hung in the air, heavy, inevitable. The gravity of the decision slicing through him. Because what he meant was not simply to fight or defend, but to confront the very enemy he had been running from his entire life. To step into the storm knowing that his life, his freedom, and perhaps everything he had ever built could vanish in a single instant. And as he walked toward the entrance, boots clicking sharply against the tiles, each step measured and deliberate, he felt the weight of centuries of power, betrayal, and fear compress into the present. The corridors narrowing, the shadows lengthening, and every muscle in his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Because he was about to face death itself, unarmed against fate, yet armored with an unbreakable resolve to claim redemption at any cost. And outside, the moonlight reflected off weapons in waiting. Enemies crouched, ready to end the man they had feared and reviled for years. And one of them, smirking with contempt and disbelief, whispered just loud enough for the breeze to carry, "The devil finally wants peace?" And Leo's eyes, burning with a mixture of fury, pain, and unshakable determination, locked on him as he whispered back, calm but deadly, "Not peace? Redemption," each syllable a blade, a promise, a warning. And the tension in the air thickened. Heavy, electric, a storm about to break. Because everyone understood that this was not negotiation. This was finality, a reckoning long overdue. And as the seconds stretched, the quiet before the inevitable clash weighed on all present. The streetlights flickering, shadows twisting, the distant echoes of sirens mingling with the pounding of Leo's heart. And he knew that one step beyond this threshold would change everything. That by surrendering himself to his enemies, by walking willingly into the teeth of danger, he was not only risking death, but he was staking the fragile hope of a future where Elena and the twins might survive. And he could not falter, could not hesitate, could not allow fear to dictate his actions. Because the alternative was unthinkable, the loss unimaginable, and as he reached the entrance, cold wind slicing across his face, he could hear the faint, almost mocking laughter of the men waiting for him. The tension so thick it was almost suffocating. And the first of them raised a weapon, the metallic glint catching the moonlight. A single bullet poised to end a legacy of blood and power. And Leo, muscles coiled, mind razor-sharp, heart pounding with both terror and determination, whispered under his breath, "I am not running. Not anymore," before stepping fully into the night, knowing that the next moment could mean his end. The final payment for a life built on fear. And as the first gunshot rang out in the distance, sharp and explosive, Elena's scream pierced the night. Her voice raw with horror and disbelief, "Leo." Yet the echo that returned, carrying nothing but silence, froze her blood and sent her knees weak, leaving her clutching the sleeping twins as the reality struck with cruel clarity. The devil of Europe, the man who had ruled kingdoms with fear, had now walked into the storm, alone, and the world held its breath, uncertain if he would return or if the silence that followed was the answer to the question that haunted them all. Did Leo survive, or had the devil finally died a man? The night erupted into chaos as gunfire rattled off the walls of the hospital. A violent percussion that made every instinct Leo had honed over decades scream in alarm. Yet even as bullets tore the air around him, he moved with a precision born of necessity. A predator calculating every angle, every shadow, every heartbeat. Because this was no longer about territory, money, or revenge, it was about life, the fragile, tiny, irreplaceable lives of his children and the woman who had kept his heart alive despite his years of coldness. And as the cartel's men advanced, weapons raised, faces twisted with cruelty and confidence, Leo's steps were deliberate, deliberate as death itself. Because every inch he walked forward was a declaration, every movement a promise that no one would touch what he loved. And he could hear Elena's voice screaming behind him, a desperate, terrified plea carried on the night air, "Leo. Stop. They're innocent. And the words struck him like a physical blow, twisting guilt and rage together in a storm that made his jaw tighten and his hands clench so tightly around his coat that his knuckles whitened. But he did not stop, could not stop, because hesitation here was not an option. And the enemies before him seemed almost to sense the shift, the change in the air. The cold fire igniting in his eyes that had once commanded kingdoms with fear and obedience. And one of the cartel men smirked, arrogance dripping from every movement. The devil finally wants peace? And Leo's reply was a whisper, a vow, and a blade all at once, carrying the weight of blood, regret, and love, not peace. Redemption, and the words barely left his lips before chaos descended, shots ringing out. Bodies moving in flashes, shadows twisting. And Leo's senses went into overdrive, each step calculated. Each movement measured as he wove through the crossfire with lethal precision. Yet every nerve screamed in terror, because the outcome was uncertain. And he could not afford failure, could not afford hesitation. Could not afford to let the past dictate the fate of his future. The fate of Elena, or the fate of the twins, whose fragile, sleeping forms were now under the care of men he had sworn would protect them at all costs. Yet he could feel their vulnerability like a living weight pressing into his chest, pushing him forward, driving him to face the impossible, the inevitable. The moment where blood and love collided. And as he stepped into the open, moonlight catching the edge of his coat, shadows of enemies darting from corners, he felt every heartbeat of the night, every threat, every possibility of death or triumph. And then the first shot rang out, splitting the night. And Leo's body moved on instinct, a blur of motion, every muscle responding. Every thought honed to one single purpose: survive. Strike, protect, and as he fired back with deadly accuracy, eliminating one threat, two, then ducking behind a wall as another volley screamed past. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, the wind carrying the scent of gunpowder, blood, and fear, while Elena, clutching the twins, crouched in terror inside the hospital, praying, her eyes wide, seeing every flash of movement, every shadow, and every gunshot with a heart that threatened to shatter with each passing second. And Leo, despite the chaos, did not falter. Every step a dance between life and death, every breath a measure of his resolve. Because he understood that this was the price of love, the cost of the heart he had finally allowed to beat again. And with each enemy he took down, he felt the scales tip. Yet he also knew the night was far from over. That for every man he defeated, more were waiting, more were coming. And the possibility of failure, of loss, of leaving Elena and the twins unprotected, haunted the edges of his mind, a shadow he could not shake. Then, in the midst of the firefight, a figure emerged from the darkness, smirking, weapon leveled. A familiar face from a rival faction who had waited years for a chance at revenge. And Leo's stomach twisted with recognition and dread, knowing that one misstep, one heartbeat, could mean the end. That all the years of ruthlessness, all the empires, all the fear he had commanded could vanish in an instant, leaving only the fragile, beating hearts he had fought to protect at the mercy of death. And he raised his weapon, breath sharp in his lungs, muscles coiled, every nerve electrified, ready to strike, and the figure laughed, low and cruel, before pressing the trigger. A single gunshot splitting the night once more. And Elena screamed again, voice raw, heart lodged in her throat, Leo. But this time, the echo that returned was not a reply. Not a reassurance, not the promise she had been clinging to through the night. Only silence, thick, suffocating, final. Leaving the hospital and the sleeping twins suspended in a moment so fragile, so terrifying, that every second stretched like an eternity. And in that silence, a question burned hotter than any bullet, louder than any scream: had the devil of Europe, the man who had walked through fire and blood without flinching, finally met his end, or had he survived? Hidden in the shadows, fueled by vengeance, love, and a heart that refused to die. Leaving Elena frozen, clutching the twins. Tears streaming, mind racing, knowing that the answer to that question would determine not only the survival of her family, but the redemption of a man who had walked through decades of darkness and returned. Finally human, finally vulnerable, finally capable of love. And as the night pressed on, filled with uncertainty, the streets alive with threat, and the hospital cloaked in tension, the world seemed to pause, every heartbeat suspended, waiting for a single movement, a single breath, a single sign that Leo Moretti was alive. Or gone forever. Weeks had passed since the night that had seemed destined to bury Leo Moretti forever. And the world around Elena had grown quiet in a way that felt both fragile and permanent. The sun rising and falling over the park with a gentle, unrelenting rhythm, casting long golden rays across the empty benches and soft grass where she now sat. Twins in her arms, their tiny heads resting lightly against her chest. Each breath a fragile reminder that life continued despite the violence, the blood, and the terror that had once consumed them. And though they were safe in this moment, her heart remained fractured. Each beat a ghost of the man she had loved, lost, and barely survived without. Because the shadow of that night lingered in every corner. In every whisper of the wind, in the way the sun glanced off the playground swings. A reminder that everything could change in an instant. That peace was always tentative, always threatened. And as she watched the sun climb slowly into the sky, she allowed herself to exhale, a long, shuddering release of grief, fear, and love intertwined, imagining that perhaps, for once, she could breathe without anticipating disaster. That the chaos of her past with Leo had ended. That the notorious Mafia boss, the man who had ruled with ice and fire, had truly perished, leaving behind only memories, regrets, and the fragile hope she carried in the tiny bodies of their twins. Yet even as she let herself believe that, a shadow shifted across the park, subtle at first, unassuming, almost swallowed by the morning light, and her chest tightened with a familiar, unnameable tension, a spark of recognition that pricked at the edges of her calm. And then, as if the world itself held its breath, the figure stepped into the soft golden glow. A silhouette unmistakable to her heart, and there he was, Leo. No guards, no dark suit, no aura of menace. Only the man she had once loved so fiercely, standing there. A single bouquet of white roses in his hands. The simplest gesture against the backdrop of all they had endured. Yet infinitely more powerful than any weapon he had ever wielded, and as her eyes widened in disbelief, tears welling immediately, she found herself unable to move. Unable to speak, only to watch as he approached. Each step measured, deliberate, and somehow tender. His presence filling the space between them with an intensity that made her chest ache. Heart pounding with a mixture of fear, hope, and longing. And when he finally stopped before her, crouching slightly to meet her gaze, his voice soft but carrying the weight of every promise, every regret, every heartbeat that had been denied for years, he whispered, "I kept my promise. No more blood." And in that single, unguarded moment, the world seemed to tilt. The sun shining brighter, the wind softer, the park somehow larger. Yet the enormity of his words pressed against her chest with the force of a tidal wave. Because those 4 words carried a history of violence, love, survival, and redemption that stretched across years. And as tears streamed down her cheeks, she could barely choke out the words. Trembling, "How are you alive?" And he smiled faintly, the scar near his heart catching the sunlight, a subtle mark of the night that had nearly claimed him, a testament to his survival, resilience, and transformation. "I died that night. But someone saved me. Now I live for them, for you," he said, and in his gaze, she saw not only the man she had loved, feared, and mourned, but the father of their children, a man who had faced death and returned, irrevocably changed, softer yet unshakable, fierce yet tender. And as the twins, sensing a presence, stirred in her arms and reached out with tiny hands, their innocent curiosity bridging the gap of fear and distance, Elena whispered through tears, voice breaking but filled with awe and love, "Welcome home, Leo." And in that instant, the past and present collided. The chaos of the streets, the horrors of bloodshed, the years of absence all melting away into a single heartbeat of reunion. Of fragile hope, of family restored, and as they hugged, Leo's hands trembling slightly as they held both Elena and the children, the sense of safety, of love, of completion seemed almost overwhelming. A balm to every wound the years had inflicted, yet even in this seemingly perfect moment, a shadow lingered at the edges of the park, distant but deliberate, as a black car rolled silently across the street, engine barely a whisper against the morning, the silhouette of a figure barely visible behind the tinted windows. And then the subtle click of a phone, almost too quiet to register, followed by a voice, low, cautious, and filled with implication, "He's alive. Tell the boss," and Elena's breath caught in her throat, heart tightening, twins in her arms stirring at the sudden tension, while Leo's gaze flicked to the street, a shadow of his old instincts reawakening beneath the calm, a reminder that even redemption could not erase the world they had left behind, that even love could be hunted, that even home could never be entirely safe. And as the car slowly drove away, the implication hung between them like a dark cloud over a golden morning. And for the first time since their reunion, Elena's hands tightened instinctively around the twins, eyes searching Leo's for reassurance, and though he smiled faintly, trying to mask the steel beneath the tenderness, his fingers brushing gently over hers, heart still pounding from years of survival and guilt, they both knew the unspoken truth: the past had not yet released its grip. The thread of blood still lingered just beyond the horizon, and the heartbeat of the family, fragile, beautiful, and new, now carried with it the silent, terrifying question: had they truly found forever? Or was this merely the calm before another storm, leaving the sunrise warm on their faces but shadowed with the promise that the world was never done with Leo Moretti, the man who had finally allowed his heart to beat again, fully, completely, and perhaps dangerously. And in that suspended moment, as the park basked in golden light, as the twins reached for him, as Elena pressed her face to his chest,